And our learning should be Zchus Refuah Shalema for those who were injured today in today's terrible attack. Okay, Mirza Hashem, what we're going to be doing today is we'll discuss the sugya of Mei Chalav, which is actually a continuation of something that Shach raises in Pei Zayin Tes, which we had left off before the end of it. We will then be doing Shulchan Aruch Siv Vav. What we will discuss is Isurei D'Rabbanan that are listed in Siv Vav, as well as Mirza Hashem will begin the Chumras of Ashkenaz, hopefully even get them done, the Chumras of Ashkenaz that the Ramah quotes over there. So 3 topics. The last one is the biggest one, all of the Chumras of Ashkenaz. And so let's begin with the sugya of Mei Chalav and Nisyubei Chalba. A little bit of background of Mei Chalav. So I printed out a few of these on the OU Kosher website. So they describe a little bit of the background of Nisyubei Chalba and Mei Chalav, and I'm going to make reference to their description over there. But first, let's learn the halachic terms, and then in Mirza Hashem get down the Metzius. In the Tur in Pei Zayin Ches, what the Tur describes is as follows. The halacha is that someone who cooks, in Sif Katan Zayin, the Tur says that if someone cooks b'mei chalav, that means the water of chalav, we'll define that bli neder shortly. The halacha is that that's not going to be an Isur D'Oraisa, it's not considered real chalav. The liquid derivative of the chalav itself, that's going to be potter, that's going to be Isur D'Rabbanan. So now, in Sif Ches, the Torah is going to try to define what exactly that is. Because of Adoni Avi Arash, the Nisyubei de Chalba, the cream of the milk, Eina Bechlal Mei Chalav. Now, I'm just using a general definition of Nisyubei. The accurate scientific way of translating Nisyubei Chalba is whey, W-H-A-E-Y, W-H-E-Y. What is whey? So whey is a liquid byproduct over here from OU Kosher. Whey is a liquid byproduct of cheese, which separates when the milk is curdled. So when you make cheese, when you curdle cheese, what happens is that the cheese becomes harder. The milk, it starts out as milk, cheese starts out as milk. As it begins to ferment, it gets harder and harder. So the part that gets harder that's going to turn into cheese is the cheese itself. The milk that doesn't curdle, that doesn't ferment, that is called whey. W-H-E-Y. Liquid whey is rich in 2 elements. It has 2 things. Number 1, it has whey protein solids. And number 2, it also has lactose, which is sugar. That's Nisyubei Chalba. So when you have this milk that curdles into cheese, the leftover stuff is called Nisyubei Chalba. Now here we have a machlokes rishonim. This that we learn Mei Chalav is not considered milk. Does that include Nisyubei Chalba as well? Or do we say Nisyubei Chalba is also considered the milk? So says the Rosh, Nisyubei Chalba eina b'chal Mei Chalav v'aseh min haTorah. We said Mei Chalav. El Mei Chalav hainu achar sheotzi min hachalav kol ha'ochel. Kungon la'achar she'asu kol ha'gvina mivashel ma'chalav v'ha'ochel tzaf memala v'lo nishar bo el mayim ba'alma zeu nikra Mei Chalav. When you separate the 2 parts of the whey, then, and we'll discuss what that means in a moment, then that's Mei Chalav. So you have Nisyubei Chalba. According to some Rishonim, that's already Mei Chalav, but we don't pass in that way. Take a look in Shulchan Aruch. Let's already jump into Shulchan Aruch. Siv Ches, Yesh Mishonim, the Nisyubei Chalba, Eina Bechlal Mei Chalav. It's not concluded Mei Chalav that we have in Siv Vav that says that it's also only Asr Midrabanan, V'Asr Min HaTorah. El Mei Chalav, what is a Mei Chalav? Hainu Achar She'osem HaGvina Min Vashlim HaNisyubei. If you cook and you separate the Nisyubei Chalva, V'Ochel Tzaf Memala. So you have two stages, if you will. In the cheese making process, you have the cheese that curdles, and then you have the Nisyubei Chalba Mei Chalav that doesn't attach to the cheese. If you recook this Nisyubei Chalba, there will be another separation. The Ochel will be Tzaf Lamala, and the Nisyubei will then cream to the top. And then you have Mayim Ba'alma V'zeo Nikra Mei Chalav. And this is considered mechalav. So therefore, what emerges is that we are machmir, that whey itself, we are choshesh for the shitas harash, we pass in Shulchan Aruch that's going to be considered chalav itself. But mechalav is, let's define this in English, thanks to OU Kosher. This is called, after extracting the protein solids, that's what the Mechaber was describing. When you cook it again, then memela, the protein solids separate from the water. The remaining liquid, now we have the scientific terminology, is whey permeate. If the water component of whey permeate is evaporated, the remaining powder is lactose. So if you're ever interested how lactose comes about, that's what lactose is. So, but what we're interested in now in for the halacha is that the whey permeate is considered mechalav, and the halacha is that that's going to be aser midrabanan. Now, there is a parallel discussion, Siman Pei Aleph, but we need to make one more technical point, because actually you could really trip yourself up, because the terminology again is a little vague. There's another halacha, and that is the halacha of Eiver Min HaChai. There is a discussion of what qualifies as Eiver Min HaChai. So we're not learning the sugya of Eiver Min HaChai, but what we will do is just extrapolate for what's relevant to understanding Siman Pei Zayin. The Mechaber writes in Pei Aleph Hey, Mei Ragle Behema V'Chaya HaTahorim. If you have urine is not considered Eiver Min HaChai. And he says the Chalav is also not considered Eiver Min HaChai. That the Gemara learns from Gzeres HaKasav of Eretz Savas Chalav Udvash. Umei Chalav Shelahen Mutter. V'hu adin lemei mechalav. So here, the terminology in the Shulchan Aruch changes. Here, Nesiu Bechalba is called mechalav, and mei mechalav is what we call in Siman Pei Zayin mechalav. The first time I was learning it, I got all confused. So mechalav is Nesiu Bechalba, so Nesiu Bechalba is not going to be included in Eiver Min HaChai, because it's still considered part of its milk and mutter, and Mei Mechalav is also going to be mutter. Here we have a very interesting shita. V'yesh misha oser bazeh. Rav Osai, this is a wild shita, it's fascinating shita. The shita of the Yereim, as it's also quoted in the Beis Yosef, holds that the halacha is that Mei Mechalav, what in Siman Pei Zayin we call Mechalav, and what we now have defined in English, whey permeate. So whey permeate, actually there are shitas who hold that's Eiver Min HaChai. Wow! So chalav is not Eiver Min HaChai. Nesiu Bechalba is not Eiver Min HaChai, but whey permeate, according to the Yereim, is Mechalav, is Eiver Min HaChai. How in the world did the Yereim get to calling this Eiver Min HaChai? So the answer is a beautiful lumdus. The moment in which you say it's not chalav at all, and it comes from an animal, so what pasuk says that's mutter? Mehechi teisi, it's going to be mutter. Elamai, it's going to be a problem of Eiver Min HaChai. It's a fascinating chumrah of the Yereim. Let's see how the Shach uses it coming back to our Siman. In Pei Zayin, we've jumped around, Rebbe say 3 places. So first was Pei Zayin Ches, that's by us, but skipping ahead. And then we went to Pei Aleph Hey, and now we go back to Pei Zayin Tes, where really we had left off at the end of last year intentionally, that to understand the next lines of the Shach in Tes, we needed to know this background. So what did the Shach tell us in Tes? Let's remind ourselves what the Shach had said. The Shach had said a fascinating chumrah. The Shach had said that beitzim that are me'urim u'mechubaros, that if you knock out that egg is going to be considered Eiver Min HaChai, even though it's not considered basar. So how does that work? So Bensi said, well, in Seder, that the pshat is that according to the Shach says that an egg, of course, when it's laid, is not considered aver of the animal, but as long as it's mu'ura u'mechubar, it's going to be considered aver. But despite the fact that it's called aver, it's not considered basar. That's the fascinating tzvei dinim that come out according to the Shach. On the one hand, it's considered aver min HaChai. On the other hand, it's not considered an aver of basar. Fascinating dialectic. By the way, that is mistaber, because milk, we're going to do in Sugya Maimid, milk inside an animal is also not going to be considered meat either. So of course, it's pashut that's not called. So not everything inside of an animal is called meat. Now, the chiddush is that even though it's not called meat, it could still be called aver. Why is milk not considered Aver when it's on the animal. Could be because of Xeris HaKosav. Could be that's the Xeris HaKosav. That's Matir. That's not called Yesh Laden. We could come back to that when we do the Sugya of Maimid. But at the end of the day, this is the Shach's Chidush, and that's why the Shach pointed out. A paradox that we paskin la'halach if the egg is developed, but it's still attached to the Gidin. It's not going to be considered Basar at all. But at the same time, you're going to have the din of Aver Min HaChai again from Siman Pei Alf. So the Shach says, if you think I'm crazy, well, your Reim was also crazy. So it comes along the Shach, and the Shach says, but that's exactly what the Reim says. U'kamoshe kasavnu le'il Siman Pei Aleph Sifei Unihidelo Karmel on Kavasaya. So it's true we don't pass like the Reim. Mehani Taimishan is Bar Lasham. Take a look at the Shach over there and pay Aleph. We don't pass him. We call Malcolm Vadai debates in Mu'uris Lekuli Alma Sirim Mishum Aver Min HaChai. But certainly, just like we see over there, the halacha would be there's such a conceptual concept exists, and even if we don't accept the Yereim for reasons that I explained over there, why Mei Chalav will still be considered milk, etc., enough to be considered milk, to not be considered Aver Min HaChai, to be included in the Xeris HaKosav of Eretz Zaros Chol Dvash, Ayin Sham, you should know that the Tzvei Dinim that I've created already existed, that construct already exists in the Yereim. That's what the Shach is bringing out in Sifkat and Tes. Gishmak, okay. By the way, Rav Miller Shlita mentioned that there are briskers who are machmir for this, Yereim. He said that there are briskers that will, here in Israel, I think the old-time yogurt in Israel was called Leben. So the old-time Leben would have a thin, watery thing sitting on top. And there were those who were choshesh that qualifies as mei mechalav, and therefore, according to the Yereim, it would be considered Aver Min HaChai. Who would have thought in a cup of yogurt that you could have Aver Min HaChai in a cup of yogurt? Who would have thought such a thing? So Rav Miller mentioned that there are people who are machmir to take off the top. Fascinating. But again, we don't. It's a brisker chumrah because you're being choshesh for a das yachid, and again making an assumption that qualifies as mei mechalav. But okay, such a shita out there exists. So this shach becomes alive. All right, gishmak. What's that?
How is it the same as the shach? Isn't like the opposite?
Why?
The shach is talking about that an egg.
No, let's not talk about egg. Let's talk about the Yereim. Let's talk about the Yereim. The Yereim. It's
using this Yereim to connect it.
No, well, right. You're right. The shach. What I meant the shach, I meant the sugya. The Yereim shita that mei mechalav is aser. So do you consider this mei mechalav? In other words, it's so watery, and what happens is everything settles. So then, who says that you need a mamish, a chemical reaction to cause that? Simply the way it's already been cooked once, and now it settles, and this is mamish, a very watery surface. So maybe that watery surface is considered mei mechalav. Interesting chumrah.
Not within the yogurt. Before that, remember to say that, and he said that you see from the Yereim that it says like the way I'm saying it's Tzvei.
Right.
Isn't that the opposite of what you're saying?
Yeah. No. You see the construct. That's possible to have Aver Min HaChai. It's possible to have something that's Aver Min HaChai, even though it's not considered chalav. So too here it's possible to have Aver Min HaChai, even though it's not considered basar. That's the parallel. The Aver Min HaChai, even though it's not chalav, Aver Min HaChai, even though it's not basar. That's what the shach is bringing about. Okay, the Chevra went through it. I have nothing much to add, but I just, for the record, it is important to know that almost every menu that exists in a fish restaurant all could be explained by Pischei Tshuva Sifkat and Tes, right? And the Ber Heitev over there. And that is the discussion that we learned that the halacha is that in Siv Gimel, we learned the halacha that dagim, there's no problem of basar b'chalav. So the question is there a mashmos in the Shulchan Aruch that says that you're allowed to eat fish and milk together? And the big discussion about sakana. So there you have the discussion where the minhag, the Poskei Ashkenaz all said that the only familiarity they have with the concern sakana is meat and fish. They're not familiar with the concern of fish and milk, but the Ber Heitev quotes that there was a Levush and others who were concerned about that, and it began to break down Poske, even though Levush was Ashkenazi, but all the Poske Ashkenaz were Mekel. There were Sephardic Poskim that were Machmir in terms of Sakana, and of course, once you have the Chashash, then you have Chamarta, Sakanta, Misura. How it works, so those who are interested in Kabbalah, most of this is no longer Meseches Chulin in the Nigla, it becomes the Nister, so that Reitz doesn't ask you to know. So, Kacha. At my bris, it's just a humorous anecdote. My father, Olav Shalom, told me that at my bris, I come entirely from Hasidim. I learned by great Litvish Gedolim. I do have a strong love for Hasidus, but and so my sandik was the Amshinav Rebbe Zechron Levracha. So at my bris, the Rebbe said to my father also came from Hasidim, but had only learned in Litvish yeshivas. So he said to my father, he's going to go to a Hasidish yeshiva. So my father Shalom said, yeshiva. He said back to me, he's going to go to a yeshiva. The Rebbe said this 3 times. He said it went back and forth 3 times. So I told Moshe Weinberger, that was the story my father would tell me at bris. But I realized that Amshinav Rebbe was breaking down the klipas, that one day even Reitz was going to become a Hasidish yeshiva. But he had to say it 3 times. He had to break down all the klipas. But still in Reitz, you still don't have to know all the nister behind why that would be so, the fish and the milk. But so nachzor linyanenu. So let's continue on in what we do have to know. Okay, so in Sif Vav, let's go on b'siyat d'shmaya to Sif Vav. So says the Mechaber in Sif Vav, Hamu'ushan v'hamevushal b'chamei Tveria ein lokin alav. If you have something that was created basar b'chalav through smoking or through cooking, then there isn't malchus. In other words, that could create basar b'chalav, but since it's not the derech to be mevashel that way, so there won't be malchus. Hamevashel basar b'meichalav. So that's our halacha that we discussed before. Meichalav is not considered chalav. O b'chalav meisa, o b'chalav zachar, o shebishal dam b'chalav pater ve'en lo kan al chilasai mishum basar b'chalav. In all those cases, that would not qualify as basar b'chalav. All those are not considered basar b'chalav. I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not halacha l'maisa at all, but it is a little bit of an intriguing sugya. So let's just let's do it. And stop me if there's anything not clear. I'll try to do this relatively quickly. The Shach and Sifkat and Tezayin, it is very interesting. What exactly is chalav zachar? So we just learned in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says that chalav zachar is ein lokin al achilasa mishum basar b'chalav. It's going to be only an Isur Derabanan. The Ramah, at first glance, seems to disagree. The Ramah says, V'chalav zachar lo mikri chalav klal. It's not considered milk at all. By the way, the poskim point out, it's Mukhrach in the Shach as well, that what he means, lo mikri chalav klal, that doesn't mean that there won't be marasayim. We also saw that chalav isha is not going to be considered chalav at all, but what we mean is not considered chalav at all means it's not even basar b'chalav midrabanan, it's only marasayin. In the past we've discussed instances where you don't have marasayin, it would not be considered chefza basar b'chalav even midrabanan. That's the opinion of the Ramah. There's an interesting question. The Shach has a fascinating take where he says he believes that the Ramah and the Mechaber were never disagreeing, because he points out that there's 2 different forms of chalav zachar. There's chalav zachar that comes from a human male, that just like it's abnormal for a male animal to produce milk, it does happen every once in a while that a human male would have milk coming out from his breast. So therefore, the halacha says the Shach is as follows. He points out that is the Ramah disagreeing with a Magim Mishnah. The Magim Mishnah writes in Perek Tes Halacha Vav Beferish that chalav zachar is asar midrabanan. So he says the answer is simple. The Shach says the answer is simple. That when you have chalav zachar, when we're talking about an isur drabanan, then we're talking about chalav zachar of a behema. But when we're talking about chalav zachar of an adam, so then in such a case, it's not even going to be in isur derabanan. So it comes along the Shach and he says sharp. He says there's really no machlokes between the Mechaber and the Ramah, and therefore what comes out for us is we should know the following: that when you have chalav zachar mi behema, it seems that the Shach concludes that that's an isur derabanan. like the above cases that we mentioned before that are Isurei D'Rabbanan. But when we're talking about Chalav Adam Zachar, so then in such a case, it's not even going to be in Isur D'Rabbanan. It's going to be certain. It's like a Kal V'chomer from Chalav Isha that the only chashash that we're going to have is a chashash of Maris Ayin. That will be the only concern that we would have. Fine. Okay. So that's in regards to Chalav Zachar. What came out in regards to cooking? So now we're going to use this opportunity to spend a couple of minutes to discuss other types of cooking aside from the standard cooking. We already discussed in the opening share microwave, but there are a few other types of cooking that we have not discussed. So what emerges from the Mechaber is that smoking, it was not considered the derech, and therefore it's not going to be an Isur D'Oraisa of Bishul. However, and what's the source for this? So take a look at the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef in Siman Pei Zayin, he gives us the source. And interesting, there's no explicit source in the Bavli, so therefore the Beis Yosef quotes a Yerushalmi. Yeah. Take a look at the Beis Yosef right before Sif Katan Ches, at the end of Sif Zayin. The Kosav Rav Magid Shahmu'ushan smoking Baya B'Yerushalmi Perikanodim Min HaMavushal. There's a shaila whether that's considered cooking. There we're talking about someone makes a neder not to eat from cooked food. Is smoked food also going to be aser? V'lo of shita, and we're not poshed the shaila. Usfeika daraisa l'chumra, and therefore we say sfeika daraisa is l'chumra. But that safek daraisa is not going to be enough to give the guy malchus, but it will create basar b'chalav. Okay, so that's the psak that we saw. We saw that you're ein lokin, but the mashmos is that it would be considered basar b'chalav. There is an arichus in the Achronim that here our former chief rabbi writes about. Rav Yitzchak Yosef Shlita in Yalkut Yosef writes the following. He writes that how could it be that the Gemara has a shaila? That where the Rambam writes, if it's on the top of page Reish Pei Dalid. Oh, yeah, Reish Pei Dalid. You have it in your booklet, Yalkut Yosef. He asks that the Rambam paskins at Perek Ches and Hilchos Shabbos Hama'ashem b'Shabbos chayiv, that if you smoke food on Shabbos, that's considered bishul. So what would the difference be when it comes to Shabbos and when it comes to basar b'chalav? Why is it that the Gemara Nedarim has a suffix, the point that we paskin that there's no malchus if you cook basar b'chalav through steam smoking? Yet the halacha is that when it comes to Shabbos that it's chayiv. Why would there be? How could we reconcile the Yerushalmi and Bavli? Now you could just say it's a machlokes Yerushalmi and Bavli, but the problem is going to be la halacha. We paskin one way in Hilchos Shabbos, that's a full-fledged bishul. So why is it when it comes to Hilchos Basar B'chalav, it's not a full-fledged bishul? So the Yalkut Yosef is mechavein to Rav Miller's chiddush, and some of the people came over to me and said they didn't fully understand Rav Miller's chiddush in regards to microwave. Maybe this would also help you as well in terms of understanding. And here he says it. The Yalkut Yosef over here reads like a brisker halacha sefer. Take a look at his teretz. He quotes from a Rebbe in his yeshiva. Tegabe Shabbos ha'isur hu b'meleches ha'adam. That when it comes to Shabbos, the isur is meleches ha'adam. Sha'adam lo yivashel v'lo yasa ma'isa bishul haragil v'lechein b'chama adam lo osa ma'isa bishul she'ein derech bazeh. Ma she'ein kein basar v'chalav ikra davar hu ha'totzah mikoach ma'isa adam. Sha'basar yitein tam b'chalav v'achalav yitain tam b'basar. Ugzeres hakasav sha'atam yavar derech bishul. Ubebasar v'chalav harei yesh derech bishul l'gabe abasar gam b'ishon. Va'amnam b'nei adam yitachen ve'enam b'vashon b'ishul. Aval hadavar hamispashal zagam kein bishul. Shachefza mispashel is gam b'ishon v'day b'ma shachefza choshev derech bishul v'nasa roy lachila kidavar mevushal. So he says as follows. He says that when it comes to Shabbos, there's one question that we're going to ask. And that's the question of whether it's the derech for people to cook this way. If the derech is for people to cook this way, so then in such a case, the halacha would be that one would be chayiv in Shabbos. So he says like this. He says that going back to the paragraph above, when it comes to Shabbos, so the halacha is entirely dependent on whether it's a bishul. So then in such a case, that would be the hagdar, that would be the full hagdar. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, there's another question, and that is whether this is the real. Does it create the same chefza of basar b'chalav? And you and I know that smoking lox is very, very different than salmon. It's an entirely different concoction. So there's room to say that the halacha would be that when it comes to basar b'chalav, it doesn't create the same concoction. However, by Shabbos, the question just is it the normal way for a person to cook? So when it comes to basar b'chalav, the question is creating the Torah's definition of a concoction, basar b'chalav. Then there's room to say that when it comes to Ishun, it doesn't do it, and that gufa is the Yerushalmi Shaila. The Yerushalmi Shaila is, do people call this a chefza of bishul? Do they call it a chefza of bishul? For neder, and the chiddush that we're saying, that the Beis Yosef is saying, is the same applies to basar b'chalav, that we're going to use the Bnei Adam's definition of bishul, also basar b'chalav, which makes a lot of sense, because the question is, have you created a concoction of bishul? However, when it comes to Shabbos, there on Shabbos, as long as you're using heat, and that's a derech, as long as it's not mevashel b'chama, by definition you're going to be chayiv. So what's the punchline? The punchline is, again, that when it comes to basar b'chalav, the question is whether you're creating the concoction of basar b'chalav. In contrast to Shabbos, the question is whether you're doing a maisa of bishul that is normal for people to do, and therefore there would be a difference between the two. That's the Yalkut Yosef's answer to the question. There is a fascinating discussion that comes up, halacha l'maisa. Okay, so let's review what we have up until now. We have a list in Sif Vav of those things that are isurei derabanan, or are not the derech for bishul, and therefore are not going to be an isur daraisa of bishul. Mu'ushan is one of them. The question is, why is Mu'ushan different by Shabbos? And by Shabbos, the definition is going to be what's normal for a person to cook. But when it comes to basar b'chalav, we have to say what is the normal chefza of bishul basar b'chalav, like when it comes to nedarim. And we have a list. Mechalav is also not considered a chefza d'oraisa. And the chiddush over here is that Mu'ushan, at least we have a suffix of whether that's going to be considered a chefza of basar b'chalav. Most of these examples are not very. The Maisa, certainly Chalav Zachar is not the Maisa. By the way, I wonder though, when it comes to Chalav Isha, we're already past Chalav Isha, if there's a chashash that we discussed, when it comes to Chalav Isha, that was a big deal on whether there's a chash bishul. We had a shach. Whether there's a chash bishul when it comes to Chalav Isha, the nafkamina might be in cases of where you're washing dishes with hot water. Is there a problem to wash a baby's bowel with nursed milk together with fleishiks? Now, there's a lot of room to argue that could very well be it's not kli rishon, that therefore there would be room to makel. But if you hold, like the shach, that there's no problem marasayim when it comes to bishul, there would be no problem at all, for sure. According to those who are machmir, when it comes to the pashib shat, then maybe yesh ladan, but there are many instances that will be entirely mutter, because if you have soap, it's going to be mutter. If it's there's room to argue, it's already a klisheni. You have another problem with it, Yosef Mordechai?
It doesn't look like bishul.
It's not derech bishul. Well, we'll discuss. Then it doesn't look like bishul. You want to taina that by simply washing, that's not going to be considered derech bishul, even if it's a kli rishon. It's an interesting point. We're going to get to that a little bit also about derech bishul by blios and so on and so forth. That actually is going to come up. Yehuda, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering. So this would extend to all cases. Let's say you have a sous vide or something like that. So that looks very much kind of like bishul, at least on the inside.
For sure. Nowadays it's derech bishul.
So you would, yeah.
So that would create basar. Somebody who cooked basar b'chalav with sous vide, it would seem to me that they're over both. It would seem to me al regel achas. I haven't thought about this, and I don't run to Paskin, certainly don't run to Paskin on something I haven't thought about enough. We spent a lot of time talking about Suvi and Hilchos Shabbos in terms of Atmana. We almost had a whole shiur on it. That when it comes to Atmana, we came out that there's a lot of room to argue that's not a problem of Atmana on Shabbos. Not everybody agrees, but that's what we came out. Rav Asher Weiss doesn't agree with our line of reasoning based on Reb Shlomo Zalman, but he has another reason why it's not Hatmana. I thought that svara, the svara that was suggested, was a good svara. But at the end of the day, it's coming to Basar B'chalav, al regel achas. It seems to me that it's a derech to cook nowadays, and I don't see why, if you're cooking in a sous vide, meat and milk together, in other words, you have meat and milk in a bag, and you're cooking, in such a case, I don't see why that would not be bishul basar, it would not create Basar B'chalav d'oraisa. I don't see why.
So even like we wanna extend the Yaakov Yosef's
I think.
I mean, I guess Chumrah.
Right. It could be connected to the svara, but nowadays it's not relevant. In other words, the shaila of derech, I think it's not relevant over here now because it is a derech to cook. So the Ishan shaila is going almost in the other direction. Is it enough to say that you're creating a concoction that's similar to a bishul basar b'chalav concoction? That's the shaila over there. Okay, what does come up a lot, and this comes up often, is the question of how to look at steaming. Now, the poskim point out that we have a Yerushalmi that talks about smoking, but as we explained, that smoking is very, very different than cooking. We contrasted smoking lox versus cooking salmon. So that's smoking. What about using steam to cook? Now, steam is used a tremendous amount in factory processing. So that is a big diyun. Chacham Avadia and Chelek Hey Simin Tes is nota lekula when it comes to bishul akum, that's midrabanan. This comes up also in terms of kashering, about using steaming for kashering. Rav Belsky Zatzal has many chuvas. Maybe Mirza Hashem, when we get to kashering, we will discuss that. There are many instances that the OU will kasher with steaming as well. So that's a corollary to this din. Chacham Avadia held that you could be makel when it comes to bishul akum, and I believe I photocopied that for you, and I'm quite sure I did photocopy Rav Sternbuch. It doesn't say Rav Sternbuch's sefer on the top. This is after the Maritz Chias. Rav Sternbuch was machmir. It just says V'yesh Machronim on the top, that he said that he didn't quote Chacham Avadia by name, but he says he doesn't like their heter. There are those poskim who say that steaming is going to be like mu'ushan, and that mu'ushan is not considered fully bishul, and since it's not going to be considered fully bishul, maybe you can make on bishul akum, and Rav Sternbuch Shlita disagrees that. So that's a big debate whether steaming you will be able to be makel and say, since mu'ushan was only a safek, etc., it's not considered bishul d'oraisa, to the point that you point to Malkus, maybe you could use it tzad l'hakal when it comes to Yisurei d'Rabbanan. That Chacham Avadia does take seriously in Yabia Omer, but Rav Sternbuch disagrees. So that becomes a big debate today, whether you have something that's made by a factory where they're not careful about bishul akum, and they're using steaming, whether one could evoke the sugya that we just saw over here, that mu'ushan is not considered a classic bishul, and it's a bayadilo of shita. Yeah?
The reason to be makel is because we wouldn't want to make it din Rabbanan and din Rabbanan?
Right, exactly. That would be one of the tzadim to be makel. Correct. Yeah.
I imagine in most factory settings where this shadow would come up, like it's probably not Olal Shulchan Malachim.
Depends. Einachanami. Yehuda Dov is right that if it's not Olal Shulchan Malachim, it's going to be fine. But there is some good food that's being made that's steam cooked, and that in theory could be Olal Shulchan Malachim. Of course, we'll have to discuss in Bishul Akum what the definition. There's a very wide range of definitions of what qualifies as Olal Shulchan Melachim. Yes?
We're assuming the definition for Bishul by Bishul Akum is going to be more similar to Basar B'chalav and Shabbos?
Right. The assumption being that, it's closer to the way Kenny said. It's certainly, like you said, that's relevant, but it's even stronger than that. And that is, the most critical factor is that Bishul Akum is only D'Rabbanan. So if we could find the fact that that's a suffix, and we paskin them when it comes to Bishul Basar B'chalav, we were makel that there's not going to, Ein Lokin Alav, which is mashma that we don't treat as an Isser D'Oraisa, or you could just say Ein Lokin just means as a suffix that you don't give Malkus. But it could be it's a Chefza D'Oraisa, that might be part of the question. But at the end of the day, the point is that Bishul Akum is D'Rabbanan, so maybe there's more room to be makel.
If we compare it to Shabbos, by Shabbos we said you would get Malkus.
Right.
You'll have to say,
right, you'll have to, right, that is a good point. Right, you'll have to say that's going to be different than Hilchos Shabbos, and it's mistaber to say that's going to be closer to definition of Basar B'chalav, unless you're going to argue that based on the Yalkut Yosef's Lamdus, that at the end of the day, it's what's the Derech Adam, maybe it's closer to Derech Adam versus what you cook. Remind me, when we learn to be Mefalpa, when we learn Bishul Akum, it's not Pasha that Bishul Akum works that way. It could be that it's more Chefza oriented, but Yesh Ladun. It's a fascinating question in terms of Bishul Akum. Okay, so these were the first two Roman numerals, and now B'siyata D'Shmaya we get to the last part. The last part is the most tedious, but the most important. It's the most tedious because what we're going to be involved with now is the language of the Rishonim in their Chumras, particularly in Sifrei Ashkenaz. We're going to be collecting from the Sefer Heter. We're going to be collecting from the Sharei Dura, and so on, and the Ramah's writings and Torah's Chatas. And basically what the Ramah did in Sivav is he collected all of these chumras of concerns of Bishul Basar B'chalav in one place, and he very much recognized, even his own chumras, he recognizes that these are chumras, to the point that at the end, let's start with the end and then work backwards. The Ramah is going to have 4 chumras over here in Sivav. He's going to conclude, Ubidiyeved ein lochish b'chol zeh, va'af lechatchila ein bezel lechumras ba'alma va'mekel lo hifsid, which is a very, very strange formulation. On the one, the Ramah is saying if you're mekel, you don't lose. On the other hand, he calls it a chumrah, and clearly he says bidiyeved, you don't have to worry about it. But these are minhagim of Ashkenaz that people were machmir for. So there's going to be 4 different sugyas, and every single one of them brings up many, many halachic questions within these 4 chumras. Now, the first chumrah that the Ramah quotes appears in the Darchei Moshe. We're going to look back in the Darchei Moshe, but let's do every single one of them first in the Haggah and then in the Ramah's language. And again, it becomes tedious because the devil's going to be in the details exactly how the early Achronim, late Rishonim, formulated the Chumrah, and that's why I mean it's going to be tedious. But there are going to be very fundamental things that are going to be dancing around these Chumras. Okay, so says the Ramah like this: Yesh Omrim, the Aser Lachtos Tachas Agder Shel Goy, that it's prohibited to stoke the coals under a pot of a Gentile, Lefi Shein Mevashim Behem Pamim Chalav Pamim Basar. Because there are times that they cook underneath it meat, and times they cook milk. And if you're going to stoke coals underneath these pots, you're going to come to cook meat and milk together. So the thrust of the chumrah, if we wouldn't be precise, then it wouldn't be tedious. What we would have was just simply the following, and that is that the Ramah is concerned you have to be careful not to stoke under the kedera of a guy because there might be basar b'chalav inside. However, what gets a little bit tedious over here is exactly what is the case. What precisely was the Ramah's case? So what we're going to do is first see the discussion through the eyes of Reb Shlomo Eger, and probably also the Pri Megadim probably saw it the same way. And then what we're going to do is see it through the eyes of the Shach, and 2 interpretations of the Shach. Okay? So we're going to talk about 3 different issues, all of them really dependent on how you understood what the Ramah was talking about. The Reb Shlomo Eiger over here, we've had his name before, and it was on the same topic. Reb Shlomo Eiger says, what did we have Reb Shlomo Eiger for? Reb Shlomo Eiger in the beginning of the Siman discussed whether we say Yesh Bishul Achar Bishul B'Basar B'Chalav. And he said it was Pashut, that if you have Basar and Chalav that's cooked together, then in such a case you wouldn't be subject to Bishul Basar B'Chalav. And he had a Chiddush that Rav Genak Shlita pointed out is a Beferisher Rabbeinu Gershom on Kuf Ches Amud Beis, and that is, but if you have cooked milk and cooked meat, and then you cook it again together, then when you join them together, you're going to be chayiv. Comes along Reb Shlomo Eiger and he says as follows. He says, he quotes the Shach. I'm intentionally not putting it back in the Shach. He says that v'yesh raya l'chora mikan de basar v'chalav shekvar nispashel yachad asur levashlo shenis. That l'chura, this goes against with what I had written earlier in the Siman. Because Reb Shlomo Eiger says that l'chura, the pashtus, again, I'm putting it in the Ramah, he's saying in the Shach, we're going to call this interpretation number 1 in the Ramah, that you could read the Ramah as saying that even though you've had already meat and milk that's cooked together, nevertheless, you're choshesh that by stoking under the pot, it's going to lead to Bishul Basar B'Chalav. Tov. By the way, what's the mashmos in the language of the Darchei Moshe? Let's take a look at the Darchei Moshe. I think it's mashma like the Reb Shlomo Eiger had said. The Darchei Moshe actually is in the beginning of the Siman, in Siman Pei Zayin, towards the end of Sif Katan Aleph. The Darchei Moshe quotes, this is Agos Mordechai, that's also quoted by the Ramah in the Torah Chatas. Bagos Mordechai, Shuvitz Rabbeinu Baruch, She'as levashel basar asur bebeis Yisrael b'kdera shel Goy. You're not allowed to cook the meat, even meat that's asur in kdera shel Goy, Shem yichata Yisrael b'gachon tachtev, v'shemel bishol bo agoy basar b'chalav. Maybe the Goy had once cooked basar b'chalav in that pot. O besar v'chalav levado. Or he cooked basar alone, and now he's cooking milk. Ubechitui over alo sevasho. So l'chura, this lashon shema bishol ba'agoy basar b'chalav sounds like that even if it had already been cooked before. Mashma, that there's a chashash of bishol basar b'chalav, even if it's already been cooked, even together. Now it happens to be that both Rav Genak Shlita and Rav Miller Shlita very much went with the mahalach that basar b'chalav that's already been cooked together, we say ein bishul achar bishul. Basar that's been cooked and chalav that's been cooked, we say yesh bishul achar bishul. So they thought that you could be madchik that the Gilya Marsha that we was talking about over here, when you might have had meat that was cooked or milk that was cooked. We'll get to blios shortly. We're going to get to blios, and there will be a chashash of bishul basar b'chalav biyachad. But it seems to me when you open up the Darkei Moshe, maybe not mashma a little bit the way my Rabbeim learned, so I leave off with the Tzar Chiyun. Rav Shlomo Eiger also didn't understand like them. So that's why I said it gets tedious. That's what I meant by, part of what I meant by tedious. To figure out exactly what was the case over here is a little bit vague. So let's crunch. The Rav Shlomo Eiger assumes that we're talking about, in our sif, what we're talking about is meat and milk that's already been cooked. And he says, still there's a chashash for you to be chote tachas the k'der of a guy because you're going to come basar b'chalav. So he says, the pashtus is that we say yesh bishul achar bishul basar b'chalav. This is one of the chumras. According to that approach, and maybe that would be why the Ramah is saying it's too much of a chumrah. There's no need to be machmir for it. Or alternatively, the way that my Rabbeim learned is that it's possible that this is a chumrah because you don't know that there's basar b'chalav that's inside over here, as we're about to discuss in the Rabbi Kiva Eiger. You don't know that there's basar b'chalav, but it's possible that you would have basar and chalav that have never been cooked together, and the chashash is that you're going to do that Isser Rabbeinu Gershon. So that's issue number 1 within chumrah number 1. Issue number 1 is, are we talking about meat and milk that's already been cooked or not? That's issue number 1. Moshe, let me just go through everything else and then that'll be my pleasure. Issue number 2 is issue number 2 where there are going to be 2 shitas, is how to read the Shach in Sifkat and Yudches. The Shach says as follows. He quotes this din, and ostensibly, all the Shach does is he adds another chumrah, points out that there's a chumrah on top of this chumrah. Says the Shach, Sivkat Yudches, U'b'Mordechai Kasav, he's quoting the same Mordechai, She'asal levashal basar bebeis Yisrael b'kter shel goy, Shema yichata Yisrael. By the way, the Shach might be mashma, like the way Rav Genek and Rav Miller learned the Ramah, that you're talking about a case in where their goy has meat in a milchik dika pot, and you're stoking the coals, and you're causing the blios of the milchik dika pot to go into the meat. Okay. Now he has another chumrah. L'chein sarich l'shfachot goyos shtei kederos, achas shel basar v'achas shel chalav, l'chein pasak b'toras chatas. Then he says, and therefore you have to request every single one of your Gentile workers to bring meat pots and milk pots. In other words, this is a chumrah, the way most Achronim explain. The Shach is adding a chumrah al gabi chumrah. And that is not only should you not be chota under their things, because it might, and if you would be chota in such a case, you would come lidei bishul. Just tell them, instruct them that they have to keep also hilchos basar b'chalav. Okay. And then he says it doesn't only apply to basar, it will apply to shar dvarim as well. That's an interesting question, what he means. I'll skip that for now. And the Shach concludes, Miu ein bazeh l'chumra ba'alma, ve'ein olam nizar bazeh. So the Shach says, this is a chumra ba'alma. So how do you read the Shach? The way to read the Shach is saying that this second din, this is how the Imrei Baruch learns it. The Imrei Baruch is one of the kovets, the Mefarshim in the back. I'll show you that the Badei HaShulchan learns this way as well, that the Chumra Ba'alma Ein Olam Nimzarim Bazeh is going on to insist that they have two different pots. That so far, we don't insist that they have to have two different pots. That's how the Imrei Baruch learns. The Pri Megadim understands that what the Shach was learning up in the same Mordechai is that even though meat and milk that have already been cooked together would not be considered bishul basar b'chalav, however, if you have meat, even if the meat has already been cooked in a milchik tikka pot, and they haven't fully cooked together, and you push the gachalim, and you cause and you facilitate the cooking of meat in a milchik tikka pot where there's going to be tam chalav, that will be basar b'chalav. Take a look at the Pri Megadim in Sifkat and Yudches. He raises the possibility of yesh bishul achar bishul b'basar b'chalav. He discusses that, and then that becomes a big deal with the Kreisi Uplesi. I'm not going to do the Kreisi Uplesi's angle. And then he says, "Umikol makom habelua shebetoch hakdera." 3 lines into Pri Megadim. Mibasar v'chalav yachad shifla l'chutz v'yispashel l'chashul dezelo havi derech bishul. He says, if you have blios basar b'chalav in a pot, and that you're cooking, so what would the case be? That the goy cooked basar b'chalav in this pot, this was already a basar b'chalav pot, and now he's cooking meat, and you're stoking underneath, and you're causing the blios of basar b'chalav to go into the meat, that is not going to be a problem, says the Pri Megadim. Avol b'sar kedema ben yoma b'chalav v'adei havi derech bishul. But if you have, as I described before, a milchik tikka pot, which is ben yomo, that the Pri Megadim says is going to be a problem. So the shita of the Pri Megadim coming out from this shach is that if you just have simply blios, that is not going to be a problem. However, if you have a blia of chalav that you're cooking with basar, so then in such a case that will be a problem. Okay. The third approach over here is the Badei HaShulchan's approach based on the Imrei Baruch. So Mahalach number 2 is the Pri Megadim's application of the Ramah, and then Mahalach number 3 is the Badei HaShulchan based on the Pri Megadim. Take a look at the Badei HaShulchan that I photocopied for you. He says that we have to even be machmir for blius. Take a look over here. There's 3 lines from the bottom of the Badei HaShulchan. Va'afilu ein nimtza ba'ata lo basar v'lo chalav. Ela maichal stami the efshar shebluim midafnosav tam basar v'tam chalim b'bishalim v'ka'avar b'bishul basar b'chalav. Wow! The Badei HaShulchan to me is a fascinating chiddush. He understands, in other words, we have three ways of applying the Mardochi. Let me just do a Geschmacka review. Number one is that the chiddush of the Mardochi is we're afraid you're going to cook basar that's already been cooked with chalav that's already been cooked, and you're going to be over Rav Genak and Rav Miller's favorite form of bishul basar b'chalav. That's number one. According to the Pri Megadim, not only is that a concern, but if you have meat with blios of chalav, that's going to be bishul basar b'chalav. According to the Badei HaShulchan, based on the Imrei Baruch, you're going to have even bishul basar b'chalav if you have blios of both basar b'chalav in the walls of the goyish pot, and you're cooking with you're stoking the pot, and the tam is going to go inside. That's also going to be achshash of bishul basar b'chalav. Now, the Maritz Chias, who is a fascinating Torah personality, and say that we could discuss the gods. I didn't only learn by giants like Rav Branchspiegel's Zatzal, but Yibad L'chaim, I was also close with Rabbi Shalom Karmi. No one could accuse Rabbi Branchspiegel's Zatzal and Rabbi Karmi as having the same approach to chinuch, but Rabbi Karmi had a very positive influence on me, and so Maritz Chias is a very, very important sefer in terms of Tanakh and response for Dama Shetashiv, to biblical criticism, but he was also a massive Talmud Chacham who wrote Shailas Uchuvas. Rabbi Karmi, like in my days, they still have that intro to Tanakh, intro to Bible. Doesn't even exist anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. So in my days, there was intro. I would have wished they called it to Tanakh, but they call it intro to Bible, and so Rabbi Karmi had his reading syllabus was he was supposed to read all the Sefer Maritz Chias. I don't think any of us really did, but that was what we were supposed to do, because many of the Yisodos that came up were Yisodos that Maritz Chias writes. Anyhow, this has nothing to do with that part of. I have a set of Kol Sifrei Maritz Chias, nothing to do with those beautiful Svarim on Tanakh, but he also has Shailas Uchuvas, classic Shailas Uchuvas as well. In the Shailas Uchuvas Simach Samach Dal that I photocopied the Chuvas, so over there, the Maritz Chias says it's pasha to him that it's incorrect to ever have basar b'chalav on blios. He says, coming back to what one of you had asked before, he said that's not derech bishul. It's not derech bishul to cook with blios. It's not the normal way to cook. So the sheet of the Maritz Chias is, it seems to me that he disagrees both with the Pri Megadim, certainly with the Imrei Baruch Halacha L'maisa. It's a fascinating discussion over there. Ayin Sham. I don't think we pass like the Maritz Chias, and in other words, I think most poskim are choshesh. Maritz Chias again is also not as standard as a Pri Megadim is, but the Maritz Chias has a very interesting tshuva where he argues that you will only have bishul basar b'chalav when you have mamish basar and mamish have chalav. If you're going to have tam chalav mehechi teisi, that's derech bishul. Einachanami, it might create tam, but to say that you're going to be over on bishul basar b'chalav, he says mehechi teisi. So of course it's going to create basar b'chalav, but is it considered bishul basar b'chalav? So that's shita, if you will, number 4. That all comes out of this first chumrah of the Ramah. What's the standard derech hamelech? Well, the Badei HaShulchan in many ways became a central part of the system of halacha, although I find the Badei HaShulchan's chumrah a little bit far-fetched. I think at the end of the day, I think the pashtus is like the Pri Megadim, and that I think it's kal v'chomer that you even have a Maritz Chias that says even blios of chalav with basar is not derech bishul, as it's sad l'hakel. Certainly to say that the chashash over here was that there were blios basar chalav seems to me to be tremendously mechudesh. So it would be in a case of shas hadchak, it would seem to me that there is room to be mekel if you know that there isn't any basar b'chalav in the pot, and the only concern that you have is that you're recooking blios basar b'chalav. So then, in such a case, then it would seem to me that there's a lot of room to be mekel. You don't have to be machmer for the Badei HaShulchan's chumrah. However, when it comes to the Pri Megadim's chumrah, the Pri Megadim's chumrah that says that if you have meat in a milchik dika pot and you're cooking it and it's going to give off blios, there's room to say that it isn't. Maybe that would be part of why the Ramah is not choshesh. But at lichatchila, it would seem that one should be choshesh for such a thing. By the way, just a little bit of history. What's going on over here in the Ramah? Just to understand where these chumras all generated from. It's going to keep on coming up, the same theme. Once upon a time, my mother, may she be well, my mother remembers from this, it has to be after the war, because my mother was born 1939, 2 months, how I'm around today is a big miracle. But my mother was born 2 months before the war began, and so this must be after the war. My mother remembers that in Europe, in other words, the Jews went back into DP camps for a few years. So my mother remembers that all of the way the cholent worked once upon a time is most homes did not have an oven. This applied in the shtetl as well. Most people did not have their own oven, but they left the cholent in the baker's oven. That was what was common in the shtetl. There was one. That's where they would leave the cholent. My mother said that the children used to go get it. Hasidim tended to be more lenient about having their children do something that at times seemed to be malacha, and that gets involved with a whole fascinating debate between Reb Chaim Meiser Grzhinsky and the Chidushei Arim about Ketanim doing malacha on Shabbos. Why do I mention this thing? Because at the end of the day, once upon a time there was a central oven, and a lot of things were happening around the oven. In other words, in America, when I was a child, everything happened around the television. 300 years ago, everything happened around the oven, because the oven had cooking, and most of the house was also cold. So particularly for travelers in the hotel, in the lobby, what was the central part of the lobby was the oven, where everybody would sit around the oven, and they were also cooking their food. So that's where you had all these shilas, because the Jew is in the same hotel with the guy. He's trying to cook his food. The guy is also cooking his food, and he's got the kedera over there as well. So now, do I have to be careful about the guy's food? That's really what's happening here, as well as the shvachos in the house that are using the same fire, etc. That's the background of what's going on over here. And so again, one more time to review. Ramah says that there's a problem. What exactly was the Ramah's problem? You could learn that the Ramah's problem was simply the way my Rabbeim understood that there's no proof of ein bishul, yesh bishul achar bishul. We're talking about where the milk and meat had not been cooked prior. Are we talking about blios as well? The Pri Megadim says yes, that we are talking about blios, and in other words, blios of chalav with a chefza of basar. And then there are those who say that we're not even talking about that there were any blios, that there's any chefza basar b'chalav, but rather we're talking about that even if you cook the blios of basar b'chalav, so then that's going to be a problem as well. Questions? Good? Okay. Yeah.
I'm just curious with the chomer of the Badei HaShulchan.
Yes.
What needs to be in the pot cooking in order for the blios to be a problem? Like, can you have water being, like, would that be a problem? Or
it's very, that's why I don't think it's the pashtus. Certainly, I'm marich the Maritzchias. So, Maritzchias would say that this is crazy. And again, the Badei HaShulchan's lashon. Afilu nimtza ba'ata lo basar v'lo chalav. By the way, he says I am b'biurim. That's where he discusses the Imrei Baruch. Fa'afilu nimtza ba'ata lo basar v'lo chalav el machal stami the efshir sheblum b'tafos dam basar v'tam b'chalav mi b'shulam she'avru v'ayidei chitu eshim v'ashum shuv osa basar v'chalav v'ka'aver b'shul basar v'chalav. Yeah, l'chura it sounds like even if there's water, it's a big chumrah. Yeah.
So,
aside from the fact that Ramah himself says even the Pri Megadim's chumrah is a chumrah. Yeah.
So, according to Badei HaShulchan, if one was doing like hagala to get rid of the basar b'chalav.
So, Mir Hashem, we're going to discuss that. By the way, the Rishonim already deal with that problem they deal with the problem of the tam going back inside. You're asking, why is it that every hagala is not a problem of
Or into a basar b'chalav pot. Yeah.
Right. Why would that not be a problem? There's got to be a good answer for that. There's got to be a good answer for that.
Well, it's Eina ben Yoma.
Eina ben Yoma, but what? Right. But for sure, Eina ben Yoma will solve it. That's for sure. I wonder if there are other answers as well. Yeah.
According to the Pri Megadim, if someone accidentally cooks meat in a milchik pot, that's ben Yomo. That's basar b'chalav min Torah. That's like asur ba'ana, and
correct.
It's min hanikbarim.
That's right. Okay, that's what comes out from the Pri Megadim. And I think the Meretz Chias might disagree with that. Correct. Yeah. Excellent.
Why is it Pri Megadim different than, let's say, what the Shach and the Berachim Moshe are saying?
No, you could read it back into. I was just. He's black on white. He's black on white. That's all. That's all.
What's alternative case of what the Shach?
You have the Imrei Baruch's case. It could even be Blios, or it could be. You could try to read, although I don't think it's Mukhrach in the Darchei Moshe. You could read it the way I had thought that I had understood from Miller of Genak in response to the Reb Shlomo Eger. They were talking about that you have meat, that the goy has meat and the goy has milk that's cooking together. But even if that they're cooking together, and right, exactly. That you could interpret it that way as well. Tov. There is a very this Chumrah number 1. Ad kan, the 4 different ways of understanding what was going on, the tedious part. Now let's go to real lumdus. So the real lumdus is that in Chumrah number 1 is Rabbi Kiva Eger's famous discussion. Frekt Rabbi Kiva Eger in Sifkat and Yudalid. I see we're not going to be able to finish all the Chumras today. Says Rabbi Kiva Eger the following problem, but let's go methodically through this because it's important. These Chumras are very hard when you're learning it the first time, so it's important for us to be mesader. So Rabbi Kiva Eger in Sifkat and Yudalid asks the following kasha, and that is Kashali ha'ena mechaven levashel rak lachtos beish upsik reish lo havid shemelo bishel hanachi b'kter basar v'gam chalav. So Rabbi Kiva Eger asks, but at the end of the day, he's an Eina Meskavein. So Rabbi Kiva Eger takes us through the whole sugya of Eina Meskavein, Psik Reisha, in both Shabbos and Kol HaTorah Kula. So Rabbosai here, again, starting with these interesting Chumras and Ashkenaz, so many big sugyas are being touched on. So Rabbi Kiva Eger's kasha is, at the end of the day, why should it be Aser? Nagid, we solved why it's Bishul Basar B'chalav. It is for sure Bishul Basar B'chalav, but at the end of the day, he's not Mechavi. V'tzarech lomar, says Rabbi Kiva Eger, we're going to do this inside. D'dafka b'safek di lahaba, shem lo ye'nasa kein k'maisa shelo, k'mo gorer kisa v'safsel, dahavi safek, shema b'grei rasa lo yasa guma. Rabbi Kiva Eger says a chiddush that is also brought up by the poskim in Hilchos Shabbos that you have to know, and that is that when it comes to Eina Meskavein, the only time we could say a person is an Eina Meskavein is if he doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. The classic case in the Gemara is that his intention is to pull a bench across the ground, and it might make a hole, it might not make a hole. Safek de laba, he's not sure. So he's not being mechavin to make the hole. If he wanted to make the hole, he would do it in a way that's a vadai. His intention is to move the chair. So then in such a case, that's a davar shem skam. But what happens if you have a safek of what already exists? So let me give you the case that the Rabbi Kiva Eger is going to take 15 lines to quote, but I'll give it to you right away to make it easier. And this is a famous case in Hilchos Shabbos. And that is a safek, what's referred to in the poskim as a safek psik reisha, but Rabbi Kiva Eger doesn't refer to it that way. He calls it as a safek da'avar. And that's the case of a Taz. The Taz writes that the halacha is that if you have a case in which you have flies that are inside of a chest, but you're not sure, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You have a chest, and you're not sure that there are flies that are inside. And when you close the chest, so then you're going to be trapping the flies. So that lechura is similar to davar she'ein meskavein. Just like when you're not sure if you're going to pull the bench, whether it's going to make a hole or not, so too you're not sure if you're trapping the flies. Says the Taz, but this might be different. This might be considered what the Taz calls a safek psik reisha, what Rabbi Kiva Eger calls a safek da'avar. When do we say that's considered an eina meskavein? That's when you don't know what's going to be in the future. But if you're not sure about what happened in the past, one way of saying it is it's a safek in mitzius. So then in such a case, then it's not a eina meskavein. So that's Rabbi Kiva Eger ways over here. Aval b'safek da'avar kimo hacha dim yesh b'gder zu balua b'basa v'chal b'chitu izeh b'vada yispashel. If there's meat and milk here, it's for sure going to cook. Ela da'hasafek shem ein bo blias basa v'chalav. Zeh mikri psik reisha. That's going to be called a psik reisha. In other words, even what's a psik reisha? Psik reisha means pshuta kamashmo. You're going to cut off the head of a chicken in order to give your child a ball. That's not a joke, right? In those days, That's why they cut off the head of the chicken if they weren't interested in the food in the chicken. So that was the Wilson basketball once upon a time. And that's how a ball was made for a child. So the father would cut off the head of the chicken, he'd sew up the neck. So that's the case of psik reisha. So maybe the father is going to say, my intention is not to kill the chicken. My intention is that I want to get my child a ball. So the Chazal say, psik reisha v'lo yamos. You're going to cut off the head and it's not going to die? Of course you're going to be over on shchita. So that you can't claim that you're an eina miskaven for killing the animal. So too, even when you have a safek, what you want to say, I am not intending to cook the meat in the milk. I'm only intending to heat up the fire. At the end of the day, if there's a significant possibility that the goy has basar b'chalav there, you can't claim that, and it's considered a psik reisha. So a safek psik reisha is not a davar she'eina miskaven. Oh, so that's what Rabbi Akiva Eger raises. And then he points out, he then gets involved psik reisha d'lo michale. Okay. It's not, in my humble opinion, it's not the best way for you to learn the sugya psik reisha d'lo michale, so I'm going to skip it. We'll do it in Mirtz Hashem and Hilchos Shabbos. I think next year, the yeshiva, not only do we sometimes learn halacha in Shabbos, but I think the yeshiva is learning Masechah Shabbos next year, if I'm not mistaken, right? Am I right about that? Okay, so then we'll learn it then in Mirtz Hashem, not on Daf Vav and Ksubis. You could also learn it then. Okay, so the Rabbi Akiva Eger continues in Sifkat and Yudal. Achein l'das hataz shekasav. That's the taz I said. The l'das hatur b'nol teva v'safik im yeis vuvin demutal nolo dahav davar sheim iskavin v'afta b'sikreisha v'kol makom dilma ein sham zuzim lohav b'sikreisha im kein l'chorod nidan heter gomer hu da eina miskavin levasha klishal nachri. So he says, but the taz is mekel in the end. So since the taz is mekel, so the taz doesn't hold that you differentiate between a safek sha'avar and not. And therefore he says that maybe it could very well be that according to the Taz, it's going to be mutter, because the Taz comes out l'kula. By the way, I have a technical halachic question on the Taz. Check this up. I thought the Taz is only mekel by Isurei D'Rabbanan, not Isurei D'Oraisa. The Taz is mekel on Safek Psik Reisha on Isur D'Rabbanan, not Isur D'Oraisa. Rabbi Akiva Eger is clearly talking about a Shaila D'Oraisa. So that's my tzarachiyun on Rabbi Akiva Eger. If you could get me an answer for that, I'd be quite happy. By the way, Rabbi Akiva Eger interestingly concludes, Kasafti zeh, I wrote this, Shelo lios ha'isur chamor ki kemat yef shelizar ovei drachim. Says Rabbi Akiva Eger, I wanted to be matzdik, again, because of what we described. Everybody's sitting in the hotel. It's almost impossible for you not to take care of your needs in the hotel without heating up the fire that a goy might have some basar b'chalav inside. And he says, therefore, I hold that a safek psik reisha is going to be mutter even by an Isur D'Oraisa. Gishmak. One technical thing that I really can't explain all the details behind, but by Shabbos, if it's going to be a psik reisha, it's going to be an Isur D'Rabbanan. In Kol HaTorah, if it's a psik reisha, it's going to be an Isur D'Oraisa. That was the part of the Taz that I skipped, but that's an important distinction, that even though they are similar, the halachos are going to come out differently. Not surprisingly, Chacham Avadia says something similar to what his son had said to us before. If you take a look, Chacham Avadia, all the way in the beginning of the booklet, in Yechav Das, everybody knows that Chacham Avadia has two different types of tshuvas. One is Yabia Omer. That's classic Chacham Avadia's tshuvas, where you see all of his gaonis and his bekiyas. Then you have something else called, I think they even call it Shelus Tshuvas Yechav Das, but it's really a very, very different type of Shelus Tshuvas sefer, and that was his Matzoi Shabbos shir. Chacham Avadia gave to this day, his children continued it. He gave very, very popular Matzoi Shabbos shiurim, and there he summarized sugyas halacha l'maisa. And often he was very, very strong in his chumras and his kulas. The Yechav Das are summaries of his Matzai Shabbos radio shiurim. The style is very, very different. He gets much quicker to the point in Yechav Das than he does in his tshuvas. His tshuvas, of course, his great pekiyas is on display all before Bar Ilan Notzar HaChachma. His tremendous pekiyas is on display over there. In Yechav Das, he gets to the punchline faster. So over here at the end of the Tshuva Yechavadas, he says in regard to Rabbi Kiva Eger's kasha, he says a lamdus. Ubeikar kushis Rabbi Kiva Eger yesh li yashev shedafka bedinei Shabbos dekaimal mlechas mashevas asar Torah lachein gam kish asafek ahu ala avar yesh lahakil delo chashuv psik reisha el bevadai melacha ma she'en kein gabi basa b'chalav. He says that when it comes to Shabbos, so the ikar is the Maisa Ha'adam. If the ikar is the Maisa Ha'adam, then of course the Maisa Ha'adam has to follow with das. So if we're going to say that's a suffix ala avar, so in such a case it could be mekel. But when it comes to creating basar b'chalav, so there the importance is whether the guy is creating basar b'chalav, and if he's aware of the possibility that he's creating a basar b'chalav, you don't have the heter melechas machshavas Asr Torah. So since you don't have the heter melachas machshavas Asr Torah, if you have a suffix of whether you're cooking it, say in Echnam, you don't know for sure. By Shabbos, he wants to argue you need to know for sure more than when it comes to basar b'chalav. That gets involved with the din of davar she'ein miskavim b'chol Torah kula, psik reisha b'chol Torah kula, but just marmokom ani lecha, that Chacham Avadia does suggest, and it is similar, if you think about it, it is similar to his son's svara that we had as well about the difference between Ishun and by Shabbos and Ishun by Basar B'chalav. There's commonality between those two approaches. Okay, this was Chumrah number 1, 4 different Hezberim in the Chumrah, and then the Razzle Dazzle Rabbi Kiva Eger, and the whole discussion of Safek Shel Avar, and Rabbi Kiva Eger comes out that he thinks the Safek le'avar you could be makel on when it comes to basar b'chalav. That's how Rabbi Kiva Eger comes out. Yeah.
In the beginning, when you was thinking about whether it was davar she'ein miskavim, and the end you're saying it's subsik reisha, but anyway it's mekel, and then they really come to the same conclusion of being mekel.
Yes, right, but for two different reasons. Right, correct. Well, maybe even not 2 different reasons. He suggests that you could be mechad between safek la'avar versus safek lahaba, and therefore, right? He's explaining the difference between the beginning and the end is as follows. The beginning Menachem is that he's suggesting what? He's suggesting that this is the reason for the Ramah being machmir. In the end, he's trying to justify that maybe we could be mekel like the Taz and say that a suffix on the sha'avar, maybe the Ramah's chumrah is wrong. That's what he comes out. That's the difference between his opening line and his concluding line.
Wasn't the meaning what you were trying to say that it could be a davar she'ein miskavim, or that was not the beginning line? I guess when we skipped a little.
Right. So that's the part I skipped. That there he discusses maybe psik reisha lo nichale, there's room to be mekel. That's the part I skipped, and I said that because I don't want to confuse you about psik reisha lo nichale. It'd be my pleasure to discuss in the Beis Medrash, but that's the part I skipped. That's it.
In the general, I'm saying in his conclusion there would be no difference in this specific.
Correct. It doesn't have to be lo nichale. We're not using right lo nichale. He's going to come out. You could be machmir. And you should be machmir, but at the end of the day, he's going to be mekel for another reason, and that's a suffix l'sha'avar could also be considered a suffix psik reisha, and therefore considered davar she'ein miskavim outside of psik reisha de lo nichale. That's what he's saying. My radar suspects that maybe we should stop here and continue next time. How many people would prefer to stop here? Okay, so we'll stop here, and we'll pick up in Mirz Hashem with the 3 chumras, and then we'll go Mirz Hashem into Maimid.